Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Glen Oaks Community College. I'm Dr. Ren Hartung. For this video, I'm going to talk about action potentials. These are charge changes that cell membranes undergo, especially in neurons and in muscle cells, and they are part of a signaling mechanism, either for neurons in terms of getting a communication somewhere else in the body, or for muscle cells, it's along the route of the signals to cause the muscle cell to contract. So that's kind of the importance of them. To represent it, I've got a cell over here and I've got the charge across the membrane. This would be resting potential. And by the way, I've covered membrane potentials in a short video that you might want to check out. So this is membrane potential in its ever most basic, a little bit positive on the outside, a little bit negative on the inside. And this would represent resting potential. And again, that's the cell. Over here we have a graph. And on the graph, the y-axis represents voltage. And this little line here is resting potential. That's that first voltage. When the cell's not being stimulated and it's just at rest, it maintains this voltage. In order to put some numbers on here, I'm going to put around minus 70 millivolts. Most neurons maintain that type of resting potential. And even though I'm putting that number on here, I don't want you to think that all cells maintain this particular resting potential. For some cells it's more negative than this, and for other cells it might be a little less negative than this. So in other words, don't think this applies to all cells. It depends on the particular cell. The other part of this graph, the x-axis, this is time in very tiny increments, like microseconds, because these membrane potential changes, they occur very quickly. I'll put two other numbers on here. Up here we'll say 30 millivolts. And then this dashed line here is around minus 55 millivolts. And I'll explain that dashed line shortly. The other thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned here, this is negative. The reason this is negative during resting potential, we're measuring the voltage of the cell, and you could imagine me having a voltage meter up here maybe, and that voltage meter is measuring the charge in the cell compared to the outside of the cell. It's measuring the charge difference across the cell, but measuring from the inside, and that's why this starts out as negative. And most of the time when we do measure, and they do literally measure the membrane potential across cell membranes, and again, we measure from the inside, just in case you're wondering why this is negative. Okay, now I think we're ready to get started. We've already talked about resting potential. Here's what basically happens, and I'll do it on the cell first. During an action potential, some kind of stimulus comes and causes this to happen. The outside becomes negative, the inside becomes positive, and then right after that, very, very quickly after that, we go back to resting. So that's it. That is an action potential. The charge flips and then flips right back again. On my graph, it looks something like this. Some kind of stimulus comes, and that stimulus is basically from somewhere positive charge enters the cell, enough positive charge to cause this negative charge to approach this dashed line. That is what's called threshold. The importance of that, once we reach threshold, there are proteins in this membrane that are going to take care of the rest of it, that are going to flip the charge and flip it back again. And I'll get to those in a little bit. Once we reach threshold, then those proteins in the membrane cause the voltage to go way up to around plus 30 millivolts, and then immediately the charge comes back down and actually becomes more negative than it was at rest, and then we get back to resting potential again. So if we represent an action potential on a graph such as this one, it looks something like this. So the real question, and to really understand it, how does this happen? What's causing this to happen? I won't get into what stimulates it. That's kind of a separate subject, but it also involves channels in the membrane and stimulus, either another neuron or something else causing that positive charge to come into the cell. That's the stimulus again, and you should know that that's the stimulus. But at this point, sorry, I told myself instead of labeling things, I'm just going to talk about them. By the way, if you're looking for spelling to words and stuff like that, when I do a YouTube video, usually within a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, I go in and I make sure that the subtitles are correct. So click on subtitles if you want to look for the spellings of words and things like that. Or of course, refer to your textbook or somewhere else. Let's talk about what happens when we reach threshold. And for that, I'm going to change my picture slightly, and I'm going to include the proteins of action potential. Here's my first protein. I got to make sure it's closed. And then here's my second protein. And then the other thing that we need to make sure we understand before we move on from here, you need to understand the basics of membrane potential. So you might go back and look at that video, but I'll explain it real quick. The sodium-potassium pump was operating, and when the sodium-potassium pump is working, it pumps sodium out of the cell. So there's a higher concentration of sodium out here. There's lots of, I drew potassium. There's lots of sodium ions out here. There are also potassium ions out here, but there's a lot fewer of them. And then inside of the cell, the sodium-potassium pump pumps out sodium and it pumps potassium into the cell. So inside of the cell, we've got a higher concentration of potassium. And we do have some sodium in here, but there's a lot more potassium than there is sodium. These two channels that I drew, these are both what we call voltage-gated channels. When the voltage reaches this threshold, that signals these channels to open. That is the way in which they are voltage-gated channels. Whether the channel is open or not depends on the voltage. And threshold, this minus 55 millivolts roughly, that is the threshold voltage, the voltage above which these channels will be opened. So once we reach threshold, what causes the membrane to go positive? The membrane goes positive because this first channel, the voltage-gated sodium channel, opens in response to that reaching of threshold. That causes sodium to come into the cell. Sodium is positively charged, so the charge on the membrane, on the inside, the charge goes up, the positive charge goes up. So once we reach threshold, those voltage-gated sodium channels open and we get depolarization, this increase of charge going a lot more positive. So I'll go ahead and label this one. This is called depolarization. And it's caused by voltage-gated sodium channels, Na plus channels. The next step, how come once that voltage reaches this peak of around plus 30 millivolts or 30 millivolts, why does it not go any higher than this? Once we've opened that channel, once we're above this switch of threshold that causes that channel to open, why doesn't it just stay way up here somewhere? And of course that would be bad because this muscle or nerve cell would just not be able to signal anymore, it'd be stuck. That's this other piece of the channel that I drew here. It's called an inhibition gate. And by the way, it doesn't really look like this in terms of its molecular structure, but I draw it this way just for simplicity. And here's what's going to happen. Once we reach this peak of around plus 30, this inhibition gate comes into play and the channel is inhibited. No more sodium gets to come in. So that's why we only get up to plus 30. We don't go any more positive than that. And now we can come back down again because of that inhibition gate. Another way to think of this, if you want to take the gate out of it, is those sodium channels, they're simulated to open, but then they're inhibited really quickly afterwards so that they don't make the membrane go too positive. So this peak voltage is due to inhibition of these voltage-gated sodium channels. Inhibition of those channels. When I'm studying, I always like to draw pictures and then label them up. It's how my brain works, I guess. Sometimes it gets messy, as you can obviously see. All right, next step. How do we repolarize the membrane? And that's what this next part of this graphic is. This is repolarization. Repolarization. That's where the next channel comes in. This is a voltage-gated potassium channel. And this one was also signaled to open once we reach threshold, but apparently it takes it just a little bit more time to open than the sodium channel, than the voltage-gated sodium channel takes to open. So this one opens at any rate. And remember that potassium is at a higher concentration on the inside of the cell. So when this gate opens, the potassium diffuses out of the cell. Potassium diffuses quickly out of the cell. That's going to cause the voltage inside of the cell to become more negative because we're losing positive charges. So the membrane potential becomes more negative. So repolarization is due to the opening of voltage-gated potassium channels. Potassium diffuses out of the cell and the inside of the cell becomes less positive. The inside of the cell becomes more negative. Remember that these channels were a little bit slower than the sodium channels. Once we get below threshold, both of these channels are signaled to close again. So the voltage-gated sodium channel closes and the voltage-gated potassium channel closes. But we end up being a little bit hyperpolarized here, more negative than we were at rest, because the potassium channel apparently takes a little bit of time to close. That's what causes this hyperpolarization. So if I take it down here below threshold, we basically go back to the state that these channels were in before we started. And my sodium channel goes back. And the inhibition gate is back to where it was before. They're ready to do this whole thing over again. So I guess to finish up my labeling here, this hyperpolarization which leads to what's called a refractory period. Not an absolute refractory period. That's what happens under the actual action potential itself. This area would be absolute refractory period, Whereas this other one over here where we've slightly hyperpolarized, that's the relative refractory period. And by saying refractory period, we're saying it's less likely for this cell to be stimulated to undergo another action potential right then. This one's the absolute refractory period because the action potential absolutely must go positive and then absolutely must go negative again before we can have another action potential. So while an action potential is happening, it's not possible to stimulate another action potential to happen. It's just not possible. So that's the absolute refractory period. The relative refractory period is called the relative refractory period because what's preventing it from undergoing an action potential at this point is just that it's more negative, more difficult to stimulate than it was back here at resting potential. So here, you might get it to do an action potential again, but you'd have to have a lot more of a stimulus to cause it to happen. So that's what's going on with the relative refractory period. And again, that hyperpolarization, that relative refractory period is due to the fact that these potassium channels apparently take a little bit longer to close than the voltage-gated sodium channels. After that hyperpolarization, we return to resting potential. And we return to resting potential by the activity of the sodium-potassium pump and the potassium leak channel that I talked about in the other video about membrane potentials, the basics of membrane potentials. I hope this makes sense. Let's do a quick quiz. Okay, so we're back to zero here, ready for questions. Here's a living cell. That's the cell that's going to undergo action potentials. While we're at rest, without any stimulus or anything, what's the charge on the inside of the cell relative to the outside of the cell? And the answer to that question is the inside is more negative compared to the outside of the cell. More negative on the inside. The number I gave you over here was around minus 70 millivolts, and again, not all cells have that resting potential, but it's not a bad starting point either. So the cell is more negative on the inside, more positive on the outside. This is that voltage, resting potential, negative on the inside of the cell. On my graph here, what does this part of the graph represent? This approach to the dashed line. The answer to that is this part of the graph represents the stimulus. Something has introduced some positive charge in here. It's introduced enough positive charge in here so that we reach that dashed line. The next question is, what do we call that dashed line? And what does it basically represent? The answer to that is this dashed line here we call threshold. And the reason we call it that is once the charge goes to this line or above, that stimulates these voltage-gated channels to open. That's the threshold for causing those channels to open. Next part of the graphic, this part of the line where we went positive, what do we call that? The answer to that is we call that depolarization. Next question, staying with this part, this depolarization part of the action potential, what causes that? Why does the membrane go positive like that? And the answer to that is it is the opening of these voltage-gated sodium channels. And once these voltage-gated sodium channels are opened, they let sodium come in, they let positive charge come in and cause the inside to become positive. And if enough positive charges come in, of course, then we end up negative on the outside, positive on the inside. And then just continuing down our action potential graphic, if that's what's happening, we get this channel open and there's sodium just flowing in there. Why does this stop at plus 30? Why doesn't it go up to plus 100 or whatever? And the answer to that, the reason the membrane voltage peaks at this point is because these voltage-gated sodium channels become inhibited. And just because I like drawings, probably I like to draw the inhibition gate as this little kind of ball and stick deal. But the big picture is that voltage-gated sodium channel becomes inhibited, and that's why there's a peak here. The next step in the action potential graphic that we've got here, what do we call this part where the voltage is coming back down again? And the answer to that is this is repolarization. Repolarization. And why do we call it, or sorry, what is happening to cause that repolarization? The answer to that is our next voltage-gated channel over here, the voltage-gated potassium channel. This channel opens, and that allows potassium to leave, taking away positive charge from inside of the cell and returning the voltage on the inside to being negative. That's repolarization. Next question, what do we call this period here where the cell membrane is actually undergoing the action potential, where it's undergoing these charge changes? The answer to that is this is the absolute refractory period. What does that mean? The absolute refractory period, what we mean by that is we're saying that there's no way, no matter what kind of stimulus you apply at this point, you're not going to get this cell to undergo another action potential right now. You absolutely can't. It's the absolute refractory period. If an action potential is happening, then it's got to happen. It's got to go through its steps before we can stimulate another action potential. And then since we mentioned that one, let's mention this one, this period here. What do we call that? And the answer to that, excuse me, the answer to that is this is the relative refractory period. We might still be able to cause an action potential during this period, but because the membrane is hyperpolarized at this point, it would be a lot more difficult to cause an action potential to happen during this relative refractory period. Next question, what causes that relative refractory period? Why does the membrane become hyperpolarized at that point, more negative? And the answer to that question is it takes a little more time for these voltage-gated potassium channels to close. And that allows more positive charge to leave for a little while, and we become hyperpolarized, more negative than we are at rest or during the resting potential. But it does close eventually, of course, so I should show that. Once we're back down below threshold, this channel closes again. And so does the voltage-gated sodium channel. And we reset and get ready for another action potential. And then the last thing to understand about action potential, we were hyperpolarized back here in the relative refractory period. What is it that causes us to go back to resting potential? And the answer to that, the reason we go back to resting potential, is because of the action of sodium-potassium pumps and the potassium leak channel, which I covered in basic membrane potentials, or membrane potential for beginners. But I'll run through it real quick, see if I can do it fast. Here's the membrane, and imagine that we're hyperpolarized. Here's the sodium-potassium pump. It's using ATP to pump out 3 sodiums and to pump in 2 potassiums. And then over here is the potassium leak channel, a transmembrane channel protein that is selective for potassium, and it lets potassium diffuse out. Those two together return us to resting potential. And of course, they were what set up resting potential in the first place. This is complicated. If you don't understand it yet, don't feel bad, as long as you kind of got what I was talking about as I went through. If the video was helpful to you, you might come back and look at the questions sections a few times as you're really learning and getting a good understanding of action potential. And as always, please feel free to leave comments or questions down below. Thank you once again for watching.